yesterday I was flicking through, it's in my bag, the Extinction Beckons book of Mike's from about 2000. And Jackie Irvin, the artist, very good artist, wrote a number of texts in that publication. And there's certain phrases which kept jumping out at me when I was flicking through it: half-remembered, half-forgotten. It's interesting, this phrase, half-remembered, half-forgotten, as though they're two sides of the same thing. And these phrases were used often to describe the work of Mike, or elements within them of objects or places or rooms which had sort of been abandoned in some sort of way. And it sort of became appropriate to think about these phrases in terms of Mike himself, because I was trying to remember when I first met him, or what my first relationship was with him, where I first saw some of his work. And I started looking through images online, and then I was thinking, oh, I saw that, and then I think, oh, I wasn't sure if I did see it, or whether I just remember seeing a picture of it somewhere. So I was trying to remember where I was in certain periods, and so I was thinking, did I see the show in Glasgow in 1994? Because I spent quite a lot of time in Glasgow in the early and mid-90s. It's this one of the tent called Charity Shop at Transmission Gallery. And I was there quite a lot, and I was in a couple of exhibitions about this time, and it looked really familiar, but I didn't know Mike then. And as I was saying to Emma earlier, I think I've got incredibly bad memory for names and faces. So I know it was a few years later when I did meet Mike. I was a curator at the Photographers Gallery, and he was friends with Simon Starling, with whom I studied, and he introduced us. And so I do very much remember the next exhibition of his, which was called Studio Apparatus for Camden Arts Centre in 1998. So Mike had a residency there, and a sort of artist residency, and he made this work during that period, which, as you can see, is this extraordinary transformational accumulation of various objects. Always seems to be shifting, always seems to be moving around. You could sort of enter it partly and see into different spaces. There were sorts of cages, but part of it as well were these what seemed like this sort of discrete sculptures within it. So at the front, you've got what looks like a campfire, and the flames were made out of cut-out bits of plastic. You have this sort of strange satanic Mickey Mouse on the right-hand side as well, with antlers. And so at times he was making discrete sculptures, and then these would sort of accumulate into large installations. More recently he's been making discrete sculptures as well, so he's come back round full circle. But I think one of the things that seems important about Mike's work is that it seems very familiar and unfamiliar, and this is sort of the confusion that I had with where I'd seen things or where I'd remembered it, because there were certain things which drew very heavily on maybe like an American Gothic. So there are certain things which looked like they might have appeared in a William Eggleston photograph, or in a sort of American film where bad things happen in the woods. If you've seen the first series of True Detective, I was yesterday genuinely thinking about just showing the first episode of the first series of True Detective in lieu of doing a talk here today, because it pretty much, the atmosphere and everything is so perfectly Mike. And I texted him yesterday and said, I just want to check, do you really like True Detective? And he just texted back and said, no, what's that? So that was that. But there's a very, despite the seeming chaos is something very important. I think Mike's work, the title of the essay I wrote for the catalogue was Ordo ab Chaos, which is a sort of Masonic phrase, order out of chaos. And Mike, like a lot of artists, works along that tension where out of chaos some sort of order might emerge. And it can be quite difficult, it's just a single image. So, but you do get a sense where things do group together, where they start clinging together somehow. It seems to me in some way that making meaning is the same sort of thing as making patterns in some way. Mike's been very interested in geometric patterns for a very long time, since the early 90s, since way before this even. So there's one piece he did in 1991 in an abandoned farm building in Yorkshire. He cast concrete in a very intricate Islamic pattern. So no one really saw it, it just really exists as photographs now. A few years, 2 years later, in '93, in the courtyard of the Economist building in London, he made a piece which has a very long title, Quranic Kufic script taken from the prayer hall of the Khulafala Mosque, Baghdad, built by the architect M. Makiya in 1960-63. And again, this was cast on the floor. It was about this high, the raised bit, so you could see it from above. You sort of had the like the plan of this design was sort of superimposed upon this very famous modernist building in central London. I don't have images of those, but I do have these two more recent ones. This is a piece called Triptych, which again is using rugs, patterns of rugs, which have a lot of very similar sorts of the use of pattern and the production of meaning is very similar. And this is a more recent piece called 408 Tons of Imperfect Geometry, which I think was in Sweden, I think. So this was, the gallery was split into two parts, and one part was a production space where they were casting all this concrete, and then it was laid out into these, again you can see the sort of Islamic star shapes. And there was also an installation of this in a concrete, in like a quarry where they sort of mine the materials for concrete. So it's sort of been returned. So it's an ongoing, you could see this as being a pattern as well, that patterns emerge within Mike's practice over, over 20 years or so. The next work of his that I remember seeing was the one that really blew me away. I already thought he was a very interesting artist, but then there was a show for which he was then nominated for the Turner Prize in 2001. It took place in 2000, called the Coral Reef, which was at Matt's gallery. And it was completely disorientating because you basically just entered the gallery door and you didn't see the sort of the scale of it. You just were into a waiting space. So it basically looked like the waiting area of a taxi, like a minicab company. But it had, I think there was a calendar on the wall from the Nigerian Islamic something, or Nigerian mosque calendar or something like this. You're sort of thinking you're not necessarily in London anymore. And then you sort of went through this series of spaces. And so one door just went straight into a new space. But all of these spaces were sort of like waiting spaces in some way. They were transitional spaces. And the attention to detail was extraordinary. These places smelt. The carpet was sticky. These didn't look, they were far, far better made than film sets, for example. If you've ever been on a film set, it's just like basically they work out where the edge of the shot's going to be and then it's just nothing there. These were completely immersive sorts of spaces and you absolutely believed that you were in them. There were 15 spaces in all. There were sort of these corridor spaces as well. The Tate owns this, so it was on display at the Tate up until a couple of years ago. And again there you just entered through a door, and so you didn't get a sense of the scale of the installation as a whole. In the interview for the Turner, I think it was for the Turner Prize, he said that the work came about from repeatedly walking past a minicab office around the corner from where I was living in Balham. The aesthetic was interesting because of the makeshift way such spaces were built and then inhabited. There'd only be a few objects or posters, but through them you could both recognise that these people were quite transient in terms of what they were doing there, and also get an idea of what their identity was. These spaces were always spaces which were a front for something else. You could get a glimpse into a back room or a door that led somewhere, that put you somewhere else. So there was an idea of a sequential series of rooms which were all receptions that never led to anything. So in a sort of filmic way, they were like setups for something. They were like establishing shots, but the action never happened. But you did get the sense that things could happen, or it had happened. And often sort of bad things, sort of dark things, nasty things, things that you wouldn't really want to be around. It's sort of, you imagine you were sort of in a David Lynch film or something. You'd stumbled into Blue Velvet. and they were all uninhabited. You didn't. This is the thing you would like Mike say. You had to try and imagine the people, what they did, who they were, where they'd from these traces that had been left, either from books that were left. There was sort of English language, Russian communist propaganda, various sorts of religious tracts, lots of things in Arabic and things like that, which is sort of inaccessible to me and to most people looking at it. And I'd say some of it sort of seemed quite scary. Clowns are always scary. So this is from the news 2 weeks ago. Okay, start that again because it sounds...
This is happening to them.
Right.
This is happening to them.
Maybe
Brianna
one more.
Smith spoke with the family who saw them first, so she's joining us live now in Greenville County at the Sheriff's Office with more.
Amy, the Sheriff's Office has been working for over a week now to try and substantiate those claims that there were clowns in those woods, and so far they haven't been able to. But they're taking this really seriously, stepping up patrols and making sure that all the are safe.
That tree back there.
Matt Arnold's mom is watching over him a little closer these days.
This is ridiculous. We got kids out here in this community.
That's after he came running home, saying he'd seen something strange in these woods.
One of them has all white face with black stars on around his eyes, and then one of them has a clown costume on and has red hair.
Clowns hidden through the trees.
What a phrase. Clowns hidden through the trees. It's like poetry. So I think what you have with this, go back to, it's called the Coral Reef, and my sense of that title for the work was that it's like an accretion, the way that a coral reef builds up, that it's individual elements which then form something larger, which have which creates a culture. This is what seemed to happen here, that you had this accretion of different rooms, different spaces, different stories, different activities, and you were trying to work out quite how they fitted together, quite what was produced by them, what was the sum of these parts. Also, the interesting thing, well, not the interesting thing, one of the interesting things about it was that as you traversed through, didn't seem to be a set way through it. You could spend as long as you want, you weren't sort of being led through. But when you eventually found your way to the last room, it was an identical copy to the first room as well, which was completely disconcerting because it was exactly the same. And so when you found yourself in that space, you thought that you'd gone back into the first room. And so when you exited, you thought you were going back into the bit that you'd entered in the first place. But of course you weren't, you were in a completely different place. So it's one of those strange things where it seemed like the gallery had actually revolved in some way and had transported you somewhere else. So these were transit spaces, and it seemed like the whole installation then became a transit space. The whole installation had taken you from one side of the gallery to the other without you realizing. Incredibly disorientating. So Mike talked about them being transient spaces. I've just used transit sort of spaces. And one of the references that we made in the catalogue was to the phrase transitional space, which is a phrase by psychologist D.W. Winnicott. And to describe this, I quoted Edward Cayce, who was a philosopher of place. And he says, just as the child in transitional space exists between harsh reality and the self-serving internal fantasy, so the person on the porch or other comparable intermediate places exists between private and public, or between the rigours of the journey and the comforts of habitation. Instead of being merely transitory, i.e. a superficial way station, a truly transitional space is often a place for creative action, providing enough protection to encourage experimentation, if not outright exploration, without being overly confusing. And it seems that Mike is very interested in this sense of a transitional space, that these are spaces which, yes, could be seen like waiting places, but they are places which open up onto other possibilities, that they allow a certain sort of play, imaginative or otherwise. And I think this was particularly true for the first space that you saw in modern Oxford, which unfortunately I don't have an image of because there doesn't seem to be one in the archive. But it was an octagonal cinema foyer space. So again, you walked in, we all know, like cinema foyer, and it was sort of, as I recall, sort of red carpet. It was rather dark. And it was that sort of space that you get in cinemas where it's like the difference between the outside world and the world of fantasy. This is the bit, it's like a decompression zone or something like this. This is the space where you prepare yourself to enter the world of fantasy and action and narrative and all of these things. So it's a form of preparation, sort of form of ritual. And this was the first sort of space that one entered in the gallery here. And again, it was incredibly realistic. It looked like a sort of old provincial cinema, not a sort of multiplex sort of place, but somewhere that obviously seen better days. And I guess in that way seemed to hark back to this idea of the cinema being entirely that sort of fancy space, when it was really the only sort of space that was available for this sort of a general everyday fantastic experience. Whereas now, people just watch them on things like this. But what was sort of disarming is that there were these doors in, I think, there was maybe 4 doors in there, in sort of every other plane of the Octagon, and none of them opened, apart from the one that you came in. And so basically you just sort of tried every door, and then you had to go back out the way that you came. And so you were thrown back into the white cube again. And again, the white cube is it's a transitional space. It's a space, galleries think of themselves being places of experimentation, places of display, places of play, where things can happen, which can't necessarily happen in the outside world, that people attend to things in a way that is different in a gallery than they do outside. We might pass something on the street without looking at it, but in a gallery we will think about it in some way. But the gallery seemed incredibly blank in that moment compared with what seemed like a real-life place that had been taken from somewhere else and transported here. Mike's very interested in studio space as well, and the artist studio, I guess, is also a form of a transitional space. It's a space where things happen, and he's made different versions of it. So this is a piece called The Black Art Barbecue, San Antonio, August 1961, which is the title of, you can see 4 framed drawings on the wall, 3 in the black and 1 above the shelf, and that's the title of the drawings. You see the clown mask again, just to, And this was based on, in some ways, on Duras and Jerome in his study. And so, there's obviously a long tradition of artworks depicting studies, usually St. Jerome, or alchemical workshops and things like this. And so this sort of history of transformation of base matter being transformed into something of value, whether that's monetary or spiritual or intellectual or whatever. So when you went upstairs for Triple Bluff Canyon, you then entered the downstairs of a Victorian house that was reconstructed. And this was the version of Mike's, what was his studio, basically the downstairs of the house that he was living in Balham, as he mentioned earlier. This is the outside of the house, with an early piece that he made called Cast Concrete Wall in Context, 1992, which, as you can see, has the sacred geometric symbols of Hinduism and Buddhism and Odinism, Jainism. I did visit it. I don't remember the wall being that. I think I would have remembered, but I think he probably took it down fairly quickly after photographing it. So so it's a classic London Victorian terraced house that he reconstructed in a disused chapel in Dilston Grove in South London. And so he built it all first to make sure it all worked, and then numbered all the parts up, dismantled it. It was all transported here. So this is a photograph from the catalogue showing it sort of being made. or parts of it being made. You can see the sort of the bay, or the start of the bay here. You can see the floorboards here. You can't really see, but this, you can imagine that's an angle there, so that's the bay of the bay window. And I couldn't help but, when I saw this, I couldn't help but be reminded of two other instances of representations of houses being built inside abandoned churches or disused churches. One's Nostalgia by Andrei Tarkovsky, a film from 1983, and this is like the final shot in it, where this is a Russian writer who's in exile in Italy, and he has these, in a typical Tarkovsky way, has these visions of his past and of homeland. This is when Tarkovsky had, or when he was just about to leave Russia himself. And so this is a model of the writer's family home, his childhood home, which then appears in this church which he had already visited earlier in the film. This shot is actually based on a Friedrich painting as well, the cloister ruin Aldana, 1825. And so there's quite, I just thought there was quite a nice affinity between those three images. And they obviously share something in terms of meaning as well, in terms of, again, a displacement of ruin, of the familiar. I mean, it's almost a perfect illustration of uncanny, unheimlich, the homely and the unhomely, the sort of one thing being out of place, but being otherwise unchanged. And this is sort of what happened when Mike recreated his studio here. It was effectively like he was just transported identically here. And so when you were inside it, it just seemed like you were inside his studio with all the bits of rubbish and tapes and bits and pieces. Admittedly, Mike does have some fairly unusual things in his studio, I grant you. It's not just sort of, lots of oil paint and pastels and stuff like this. There's some fairly strange things, but it's sort of recognizably a place of making. And it was sort of unusual to see it in this sort of environment. But what sort of strange visions were summoned in this space? They weren't the visions that the writer has in Nostalgia. They were the visions of a VHS tape that Mike had bought in San Francisco, which hopefully the sound won't be too crazy. I might be able to play you part of it. So they weren't Misket, but they were rather grainy with poor sound quality.
That this is not happening by chance. I believe these things are happening purposely, and I think that this government is allowing these things to happen, and in many cases causing them to happen purposely according to a plan. There is something called dialectics, Hegelian dialectics, we can get into later, but the whole idea is to cause people to be frightened, and in order to frighten people, a frightened and fearful people will do things for you. They will submit to you if they're sufficiently frightened. And so the governmental context of what I'm saying is that the government of this country wants people to be frightened. That's why they're continually turning criminals back out into the streets. They go in, they kill 15 people in a McDonald's. They get a $250 fine and a 3 years in jail, which is, and then when we find out what actually happened, they got 1 year, and the fine was commuted, and so they're back on the streets. They're turning murderers back onto the streets. There is no doubt in my mind that it is not because of loss of space, so they don't have the space for the criminals. They got space for you if you don't pay your taxes. The point is that they do not want. They want as much chaos in society as possible. It's a very simple. The World Health Organization came out a long time ago, and since then the FBI has concluded the same thing, that the truly criminal element in America
is
less than 1%
he doesn't
of the
get back
total
to Hegelian
population of
dialectics.
America
You'd be
are
surprised
truly
to know.
criminal elements.
He sort of lets that one go.
are the murderers, are the real serious
But he
criminals.
does talk a lot about
Logic alone would
taxes
tell you that if you put those people
New
in
World
jail or
Order
you put them to
and,
death, you don't have it.
Of course, the American government creating chaos. But it's not the sort of chaos that you find in creation myths, which is open and which allows new things to happen, new things to emerge. It's obviously a chaos which brings about a fascistic order, which is about fear. You'd be pleased to know that Jordan Maxwell just made some videos about Donald Trump, which I couldn't bear to watch in preparation for this talk, I'm afraid. So it's sort of interesting because some of the things he said, even some of the things you just heard, are in some ways incredibly accurate diagnoses of things that Trump does. You know, create a fearful people and they will submit to you. That's a perfect example of how Trump operates. Everything else he says, you sort of think he's bound to be a Trump supporter. On the website at the moment, you can buy T-shirts about defending the Second Amendment, you know, the right to bear arms, etc. So you can't imagine he's a Bernie Sanders supporter, is what I'm saying. So this video goes on for about an hour. This is just the trailer, which basically is just the first 4 minutes, then it stops. So it's not really the trailer; it's just the first 4 minutes. But it's as you could sort of tell, it's incredibly like listening to Trump speak, like listening to me talk now. It's a sort of rambling, overlapping, promise to return, doesn't quite return, builds on something else, falls away, starts ranting again. And in a way that sort of mirrors this sort of chaos that he imagines happening. Although there's actually a sort of massive, with all conspiracy theories, it's all about control, obviously. And of course it's not just the US government that's doing all this. The US government's but one player in this large worldwide conspiracy, which obviously involves the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta, every Masonic organisation, obviously, the Illuminati, who obviously have their symbols all over the dollar bill, as he goes on to point out. He's really fascinated by typography and logos, the logos of power, or the logos of power. He analyses this whole thing about Exxon, the oil company, that the double X of Exxon logo becomes the double cross of Eastern Freemasonry. The shell logo is not actually a shell, despite the fact that they're called shell and it is a shell. It's actually a sunrise between two mountains, which is of course the dawn of the New World Order. Obviously not a shell with shell written underneath it. And he goes on in his lecture to point out that he writes to these companies and says, I've found you out. I've spotted that hiding in plain sight, you've got all of these symbols which betray the fact that you're creating this New World Order. And supposedly the public relations departments for these companies write back and go, you got us. Yeah, absolutely right. He just didn't think to bring any of these letters with him during his presentation or to show them in any way at all, so we just have to take his word for that. Also, the photograph that he has of all the living ex-presidents of the United States wearing red and black KKK robes, standing in front of a pit of fire with a 20-foot owl behind them. He's got a photograph of that as well, but once again, unfortunately, thinks not to show it. I think one of the other things why he's so interested in this sort of power and logos is that of organisations, of agencies of the state, is that he was actually convicted of producing fraudulent international driving permits in America as well. So his attention to detail was probably quite precise at this point, or maybe not quite precise enough. Going to move on to the third sort of part of Mike's show, because it sort of existed in three sections really, three spaces. There was the first space, the cinema space, the lobby, which sort of seemed to introduce you to something, which promised you into a different space and then denied it you because you then just had to walk out the way you came. Then you had a space which was sort of then like a cinema space in a way, or a projection space. You had the downstairs of this Victorian terraced house had been transformed into a projection booth, because through the window, so I didn't explain this very well, through the bay window was projected then this video of Jordan Maxwell illuminating us all about the Illuminati. And then you pass through this sort of other corridor space where you sort of opened up onto bits of sand, and this was the relationship to Robert Smithson, which I'll talk about a bit more. But of course, Robert Smithson, for those of you who know, well, American artist, born in 1938, I think, died in 1973 in a plane crash while building an earthwork. And like a lot of artists in America in the mid-60s and elsewhere, he was very interested in geometry and systems and forms of progression and regression. So this is a sculpture called Octagon 2, as you can see. He was also a fantastic writer, and he wrote a lot about the artists who were around him, who were making works. And again, in describing other people's works, he described his own fantastically well. So if I can find it. So he wrote, in Harper's Bazaar, American magazine, in July 1966, he wrote an essay called The X Factor in Art, which is not what you think now. But he wrote about Robert Morris and Ad Reinhardt, and in that he says, the artist embodies in his work not only the facts of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but also the structure of the number system in terms of modules and units. Concepts such as mathematical crystal structure, set theory, clock math, and the Cuisenaire rod method disclose to the new artist uncharted abstract territories of the mind that he explores in terms of concrete structure. I mean, you could take that literally and see that Mike has made concrete structures which work in a similarly geometric pattern sort of way, although these seem to be more abstract, lots of the work, people like Solowitz as well. But I think the thing that's worth remembering, which often gets overlooked, is the fascination that lots of these artists had with magic, mysticism, and religion. I mean, Smithson was quite a bibliophile, but at his death, so he was young when he died. He was 35, but he already had over 100 books about religion and mythology, and hundreds more about science and maths and philosophy, etc. I also think what the first line of Solowitz's Sentences on Conceptual Art is from 1969, so like the founding text of conceptual art. Conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. And so there's a lot of mysticism, again, beneath these systems of geometry and what might seem as being rather abstract and mathematical and rational. They were sort of subverting this. So in 1970, Smithson was invited to Kent State University by a friend of his called Robert Swick, who was a student there. So he was asked to do a lecture, to do some tutorials with the students, do some crits, and maybe make a piece of work as well, a new piece of work, because he was, by this time, had started to make what became known as earthworks, which was a term he took from a Brian Aldiss story called Earthwork. And it was great that Brian Aldiss wrote a piece. When Mike asked me to write the piece in the catalogue, it was like, oh yeah, great, that'd be fantastic. Is anyone else writing? And he went, oh yeah, Brian Aldiss. I mean, really. But there was a really sort of fantastic connection that Brian Aldiss wrote this story that Smithson bought. He talks about buying the book. He wrote a piece called The Monuments of Passaic. And he describes buying the paperback in the bus station and then reading it on the bus while he's on his way to Passaic. So there's a sort of a nice pattern or circularity there. So Smithson had been making these earthworks, which are sort of works in the lands using earth and reshaping it in various ways, often bringing materials to it. Spiral jetty being the famous example of a spiral jetty, funnily enough, in the Salt Lake in Utah. But he wanted to make a piece with mud, where he basically just made a bit of ground very, very wet and turned it into mud. He didn't know that Hans Hack had made a piece the year before this. But he thought about doing this in Ohio. It was also one of the coldest winters on record, so basically you couldn't make mud because everything just froze instantly. So he'd be doing these other pieces. So this is a piece in Rome the year before called Asphalt Rundown. It has wonderfully descriptive titles. This is asphalt running down a hill off the back of a tipper truck. So there's a sense of entropy of a simple system, then producing unforeseen effects, really, that you couldn't predict the way that the asphalt would run down. In the January that he was there, January 1970, that he was in Kent State, he made a piece for one of the very famous exhibitions that Lucy Lippard did called 955,000, which was an exhibition in Vancouver. She did these series, which became known as the Numbers exhibitions, where the title of each exhibition was the population of the city that it took place in. So he made a piece there called Glue Pour, where they poured a vat of glue down a hill, and although it was quite thick and it was quite cold, it did actually run, but they didn't have any glue. So after he'd done his crits and whatever, he just went back to the house of Brinsley Tyrrell, who was the professor there at the time, and prepared to go home. And the student said, "No, you can't go back. You've got to make a new piece." And so he said that he'd always wanted to make a piece where he buried a building. And so they found a building on the campus, this woodshed that wasn't really being used for anything. And then, so 22nd of January 1970, students were there, someone filming on Super 8. They hired a digger and got a contractor in. And basically he just took some earth from a building site on another part of the campus and started dropping it on top of the central beam of onto the roof of this building. And the idea was that would happen until the central beam cracked. And so that's what they did. He just piled on more earth, and then the central beam cracked, and then that was it. That was the work over. And afterwards, Smithson donated the piece and the land and the area around it, I think about 25 feet around it, and said that that would remain as an artwork, but it shouldn't be preserved, that it should be subject to the same sort of entropy, weathering, disintegration, that he'd sort of accelerated in some way. And so it's often described that the work began on the 22nd of January 1970, but it wasn't made then because it's continuously being made. It's continuing to be made now because it's still falling apart. It was burnt at various points, and different things happened. Some big things happened I'll talk about now. So this is a video that Kent State University produced about the piece.
Nobody was planning on it from this work of art. It happened and it became a thing.
For some reason it's saved so that you can't hear the voiceover, but you can hear the lovely guitar music.
He always wanted to bury a building.
So this is Smithson. You can see he's wearing a strange balaclava. So this is Brinsley Tyrrell, who's the professor with whom he stayed during the week. And he's just sort of describing the process. This, you can see it sort of a bit later. You can obviously see the grass and various things have started growing on it. This is sort of quite important. In the voiceover it says, and then May 4th happened. And then it just goes on about other things, about it being burnt. He talks about seeing photographs of it in the Whitney, and so it's just a piece that was made on the spur of the moment with no planning made, at a couple of days' notice, and it's now become quite a mythic piece of American art. let's see if the sound, hopefully the sound with this one will work. Doesn't seem like.
Tear gas first started down the Commons, then the guard moved up on both sides of Taylor Hall and forced the kids off the Commons. Then one group, I don't know how many there were, 50 maybe, perhaps more, perhaps less, moved down to the practice football field.
After you feed them, then what will we do? Will you ask them to leave?
They've got grievances, they've got demands. There are demands on both sides. We have to talk.
And then there were a whole lot of kids around them. A few kids were throwing sticks and stones, but that was only a handful, not more than 10, 15. And then the guard shot some tear gas up on the hill to disperse the crowd, and the kids picked it up and threw it back.
File. Guard will make a perimeter, a circle, right out in here. From the right, you move out. You got a big circle around here.
You don't talk during a state of emergency, Mike. You know that. Come on.
I'm sorry, but
We'll
I don't
talk
want
as
people
soon as
shot.
we get this
I don't
settled
want
down.
people shot on this campus. This is a citizen's school.
Who wants people
All
shot?
right, but they're sitting quietly.
Okay, will you ask them to leave?
This area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
And all of a sudden I heard the shooting. And then I saw people dropping to the ground, and then I fell to the ground also, because I couldn't walk anymore. And
what the investigators have to determine then is whether indeed there was a sniper and whether the guard was justified in firing its weapons, or whether, as some people here believe, the guard, under the pressure of a rock-throwing attack, panicked and fired its weapons indiscriminately, killing 4 people. Mike Pappas, CBS News, at Kent, Ohio.
You can imagine that there wasn't a sniper, obviously. And obviously no one was charged and nothing happened. Well, nothing happened to the people responsible, but a lot happened to lots of other people. And obviously this became an incredibly important event. It was the point where a lot of sympathies shifted, people who were sort of quite conservative in some ways. This was basically the students were protesting about the invasion of Cambodia, which was a sort of an extension of the Vietnam War. And the protest has been going on for quite a while. Even on the, you saw the newspaper in the previous video of the partially buried woodshed. That was the university newspaper, and most of that newspaper was taken up with the protests because the invasion had just happened. And so the protest has been going on for a few months, and then there was the shooting. You might know the Crosby, Stills and Nash song, Young and Nash, "For Dead in Ohio," which is based on this. There's a couple of quotations from Nancy Holt, who's an artist, also an earthworks artist who died a couple of years ago, also happened to be married to Smithson during this period. And she describes how for a lot of people this piece became, this shooting seemed to be a point of breakage really, and so the fact that it happened in the same place as the woodshed, it seemed to be a point where something really was broken, that the shootings acted, they were symbolic of the breaking of the central bar as well. You know, it was irreversible. This is the thing about entropy, it's not reversible, it carries on disintegrating. She says, I think one of the most shocking things when I look back with the Kent shootings, it shocked me more than the president getting assassinated. I think it changed everyone's mind, even those who were conservative. So many people just switched overnight after that. Everything just became very, very clear. She talked about Smithson's work being intrinsically political, even though it wasn't obviously political. He was someone whose writings maybe had a greater sense of making social references. His artworks themselves didn't seem to that much. But he sometimes talked about the work being prophetic. And during the summer, I don't have an image of it, but you saw on the TV the bit before where it said May 4 Kent 70 across the top beam, sort of across this bit here. So during the summer, when no one was around, someone painted that on this bit of graffiti. So that sort of became, the partially buried woodshed became like a symbol in some way of revolt against the invasion of Cambodia. And then what happened subsequently about, yet another demonstration of excessive state force against peaceful protesters. Again, Nancy Holt says, obviously the students, whoever did that graffiti, it's an example of graffiti that enhances. The students obviously recognize the parallel, piling the earth upon until the central being cracked, as though the whole government, the whole country were cracking. Really, we had a revolution then. It was the end of one society and the beginning of the next. So, as you can see, upstairs on the top floor, you came through this space, out the front, sort of where the stairs are, and then look back on it. You couldn't enter this dune, but what you saw was a version, a slightly scaled down version, but still a sort of pretty life-size version of the partially buried woodshed. But here it's not just with some, actually not very much earth. When you see the pictures of the partially buried woodshed, didn't really have that much earth on it. It collapsed fairly quickly. Here you've got this covered in within a sand dune. So it's like Mike's studio being transported to a different place. This is something which has a very particular social, political meaning, a particular place, and being transported to something which is sort of archetypal, really, sort of timeless, and riddling in a way. This enormous sand dune, and this transformation seemed to put it or transform a piece into a work of science fiction. Again, the first thing that I thought of when I saw this was, the end of Planet of the Apes and Charlton Heston. Damn you all to hell! You did it! You blew up. You see the Statue of Liberty in the beach, and he realizes that he's back on Earth. And so there's a sense of time being enacted, of being accelerated, of you being aware of it in a way that we can't be aware of. I guess we're aware of our own daily experience and decay, of something which seems to happen over a far, far longer period. It's difficult for us to imagine, and this seems to be a sort of a very cogent symbol of bringing those things together. No, that wasn't the right image, never mind. But Ballard was, Ballard's an enormous influence, J.G. Ballard's an enormous influence on Mike. He was also on Robert Smithson as well. Smithson quoted him a number of times. And in one of the stories, The Voices of Time, which Smithson is known to have had, he had the book and read. It opens with a man making a mandala, scoring it into a swimming pool, I think, and then he makes this big concrete one out in the desert. And on the second page, right in the middle, it says, "I'm sorry, Robert, what can I say? Maybe even the sun is dying," or something like this. And I just imagine Smithson sitting on the bus going, "Oh my God, he's talking to me." But Ballard was incredibly important for both these people, and I just wanted to finish with a quotation of his, which we had, which was from quite early on. Well, again, he's writing about science fiction and the catastrophe story. He says, "I believe that the catastrophe story, whoever may tell it, represents a constructive and positive act by the imagination rather than a negative one, an attempt to confront the terrifying void of a patently meaningless universe by challenging it at its own game, to remake zero by provoking it in every conceivable way." It seemed to me very clearly that this is what Mike was doing, that he was making a piece which was catastrophic, but there was a challenge to the sort of the general catastrophe of things as a sort of as a challenge to sort of try and face up to it in some way. So there were probably some other things, but I've probably forgotten them. But then I remembered that Mike had this jacket with the Uneasy Acts on the back, so that seems an appropriate place to stop. Thank you. looks so dreamy there. He looks like some sort of 50s pop star. Just while there isn't, the Uneasy Acts was this sort of fake biker club, biker gang that he sort of invented as a other character, not necessarily as an alter ego, but it's almost, he's very interested in narrative, obviously, and lots of the sculptures, the installations are like expanded narratives, narratives made concrete or real using objects and things like this. And so some of them, like the one at Camden, those sort of space, some of you would see a jacket with the Uneasy Acts written on the back, or there'd be biker helmets and things like this. And so there were these hints at other stories of backstories in some ways. This is why True Detectives seem to be important, because there's a whole backstory about Rust being in a biker gang early on when he was sort of undercover. Dan?
Absolutely great, thanks, Jeremy. I wondered if at one point towards the end you said entropy isn't reversible, I think, yeah. And that's sort of chime for the thing I was wondering all along, which is that, I mean, we're not only talking about Mike's work, we're looking back at it, and it's a work that itself is all about looking back, and is also sort of engaging with entropy, but also with works that engage with entropy themselves. And we're maybe at a time now where that kind of auratic, entropic moment in art isn't there in the same way anymore. There's a different aesthetic, there's a different sort of thing going on. And I wondered if you could expand on that. Is it really right that entropy is a one-way street, or, and if it is, what's involved when we look back in the way that we have been?
Tough question. I think technically entropy is a one-way street. Smithson described, because he used the phrase a lot, I think one of the essays he wrote was called Monuments to Entropy, or the Entropy of Monuments, one way round. Two different meanings, but it was one of them. So he was asked about entropy a lot, and his image of entropy was that if you had a sand pit that was split in half and you had black sand on one side and white sand on the other, if you walk around it clockwise, you would start mixing it up and you would just get grey. But then if you started walking around it anti-clockwise, it wouldn't go back to being black and white, it would just carry on being more and more grey. And that was entropy. It was just this sort of an accumulative disintegration in some way. Of course, the reverse of that, and entropy was, originally about the heat death of the universe, of everything becoming the same. Of course, the opposite of that is accretion and accumulation and pattern, which are the other things that we've been talking about, where you have these sort of discrete separate elements which then seem to adhere to each other in some way and come together and then produce meaning and form and those sorts of things. And that seems to be, I guess, one of the things which Mike and Smithson and Ballard are interested in. It's that point where, when does the catastrophic become positive and generative rather than just destructive? So I guess in an actual sense, one can use entropy to produce, but the process itself is sort of disintegrative, but I guess one can arrest it at a certain point. So I'll have an image of that, or I'll have it in that form, and then use that and join it to other things, because you do have, I guess in a scientific way, emergence is the opposite of entropy. Emergence is this thing where you have this things coming together and producing unexpected results. And I think at one point that was starting to be called negentropy, so the opposite of entropy. And it seems to be that what artists do is walk that balance between sort of emptiness and, if not fullness, then what's the bit? Well, it's a bit like creation myths. What's the bit just before nothing? Nothing. You can't have that, but so every creation myth has something. It's sort of on the face of the water. It's like, oh, there's a face and there's water, so it's not nothing. so it's difficult to imagine nothing, but what's the next bit then that you then need in order to produce more? And I think that's the bit that a lot of a lot of artists are interested in, writers are sort of traversing in some way without tipping too far into, I guess, a form of instrumentalism or illustrationism or things which don't seem open. There seems to be an enormous amount of openness in what Mike does, that you don't necessarily really know what's happening or where you are, or if you really want to be in there much longer or think about it much longer. Yeah. Does that make sense? Stunned you all. Sorry?
What's he up to at the moment?
He's making more discrete sculptures, I think. I mean, he's done some big he was telling me yesterday, and I've forgotten where he's just done an installation, and I can't remember. I think they're incredibly. You can't believe how time-consuming they are to make. Well, maybe you can imagine, but you know, they're so difficult to make. They don't work within the economy of the art world at all. Incredibly expensive. Very difficult to sell afterwards. You know, Tate bought Coral Reef, but I don't know how many years later. 10 years later, maybe. So all of that material needs to be stored. You know, it took 3 months. Took him and a team of assistants 3 months to build it. You know, you can imagine the expense of that. So even on purely economic terms, they're incredibly difficult to make. The attention to detail, all of this sort of thing, are just physically exhausting. I was in a show with him. Graham Gusson and myself had made a video piece, and we were in a show at Tramway in Glasgow. And Mike had made one of his installations, which is sort of typical of the time. Seemed to have antechambers and rooms, and we sort of turned up on the day of the opening and just handed over the DVD and sort of checked the projector was all fine, and that was it. It was great. And he'd been there for a month with 2 other people building this thing, and you know, he was sort of panicking. In the end, he was sort of like, you know, chipping bits of paintwork on a skirting board and then pouring. He had like a 2-litre bottle of cheap cider that he was sort of spraying around the carpet and stuff, so it'd be sticky and smelly and things like this. And I think it just sort of takes its toll, because the only places that can afford to make these sorts of things are big biennales, you know, Venice, etc. But it then means, well, I was going to say, that means you're living in Venice for 3 months. I mean, oh, yeah, terrible. But you know, he does have a partner and kids and stuff like this. You know, it's very difficult to do. So it's I think there's all these other tensions of like wanting to do it and it being tiring to do it, and then making smaller pieces which you can play out some of these things, which is also where he started doing. You know, he was making discrete sculptures as well. So I think it's a mixture of things, but he's more able to choose what it is that he wants to do now as well. So
he was wasn't he Richard Wilson's assistant?
Yeah. Used to making big things which can't move around much.
But somehow he's kind of more in the art world, if you know what I mean, than Richard Wilson is in a way. Who's his gallery? I can't remember.
Matt's.
Oh, it is Matt's.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And Neuger Rimschneider in Berlin, and I think he was at 3 or 3 in New York.
Yeah.
But it took quite a while. In a way, Matt's, for those who don't know, it's a sort of a strange, it's a commercial gallery, but seems like not to be a commercial gallery in some ways. It's sort of, it's this, again, like a transitional, to use that thing again. And they could support him in a way that, you know, maybe a more straightforward commercial gallery wouldn't at that early stage. I mean, they would, once you become successful, of course, then they could just poach successful people. But, you know, to make that investment at the beginning, you know, Robin, his director, would, you know, looked after him and did that. But it's a difficult thing. It has been a difficult thing. I can actually remember after the private view when we we were staying in a hotel just down the road. We was talking about this and just sort of saying it was really. It sort of seemed to be a struggle, like deciding which way to go and which path to do, because you want to make these big pieces. And this is, you know, I can't remember seeing a piece as ambitious as this, really, by an artist of this age. You know, it's sort of extraordinary, amazing piece of work. And the amount of work that involved in it, and the planning and the expense and stuff, for something that can't be shown ever again. I'm like, who's going to show this? It's impossible. He would need to have like a massive Tate retrospective in 10 years, which he should have, and then maybe they would reproduce it. But maybe architecturally it only works here because of the spaces that you enter and stuff like that. So, but what's great about, I mean, he's great for lots of reasons, but one of the things is that he does what is necessary for the work. It's complete commitment to the work, complete commitment to the work. And if that means that you have to be somewhere for 2 months or 3 months in order to make it, then that's what you do. He doesn't think, oh, well, I'll make a different version of it so I can just come in and out and stuff. He just won't do it. He has to be there making it. So even if he does have assistants, he can't just go off for a while and let them get on with it. He has to be there overseeing it all the time. So
you have to be quite confident in the idea, and then maybe that wasn't such a great thing.
yeah, which seems extraordinary to me, to be that, have that. I can't even imagine what that must feel like, to be that confident in something that you've come up with is good enough to sort of say, oh yeah, I'm going to build like a massive sand dune in your upstairs gallery. I mean, no, technically it's not, hundreds of tons of sand, but that's quite a thing to go into a meeting and sort of, I feel nervous about saying, well, can we just black out the windows? And it's like, is that all right? It's a bit, but that's extraordinary. But he seems like he's always been, like Graham, a friend of mine, I say the guy that I made the video with was one of Mike's tutors at Chelsea, and said he was as a student, just like knew it, just knew what he was doing. But he's very unassuming. He's not a sort of big character. He's not brash. He just sort of gets on with the work very quietly, just making stuff, and it's sort of really extraordinary to see it. And that's what was great, going to Dilston Grove and seeing it being made and things like that, because you realise that you don't get that effect by chance. It doesn't just happen by accident. It happens by enormous amounts of work and attention to detail and marking everything, photographing everything, marking it, getting every little effect. So say if you go on a film set, you just realise, like close up in real life, just how shoddy they all are. They don't look real at all. But through a camera, they're fine, and post-production, etc. But this is a place where people are going to sit and then look through it, go through stuff, and yeah, incredibly admirable. But he should be seen more. He had a really fantastic show in Birmingham a couple of years ago, which was quite unusual for him. But again, it was totally brilliant, I thought. Which is, he collected, when lorries have the tyres blow out, you often when you drive down the motorway and you see like big loads of tyre at the side of the road. He took, it was Birmingham, M6, M5, M1, blah, blah. He collected these bits of rubber, tyres, and then like the ribbons of them had just sort of placed, and he had this sort of white platform in the middle of the space that you walk around, and then just, it sounds terrible, and I'm not sorry, but it was amazing, because they were sort of, they held this thing, they had all the things which classical sculpture is supposed to have, like the Laocoon or something. It was about movement, stasis, tension, things just about holding in place. This is like, it's entropy and negentropy. It's the thing just holding in place before it collapses. All the things which Winkelmann and everyone wrote about in terms of classical sculpture, all had it. Tyres from the M6 on a white platform. It was amazing. And that's where you thought, you don't even have to make stuff, Mike. You can just collect bits of rubbish from the side of the road and place them on a platform. It sort of made me sick, to be honest. because like you sort of think, I don't have the commitment to make work as involved as this physically, but that the sort of poise effectively that he had in terms of an idea, and then revealing the poise that these bits of detritus also possessed if placed in a certain way. Amazing show. Really, really simple, but really fantastic show. So, yeah, I'm a fan, obviously. But if you ever get a chance to see, I don't know if any of you saw the show that was here, really amazing. If you get to see any of his shows, if you hear that he's doing a show in London at Matt's or anywhere, go and see it. He's a really, really fantastic artist. Thank you.